Okay. So we can begin. Good evening and welcome. I'd like to begin the event this evening by honoring an old friend who unfortunately died maybe 10 days ago, a week ago. And that friend is Michael Zacharian. Michael was our neighbor. He literally lived, 40 or 50 meters, yes, from the Christchurch compound. And Michael's been a friend of ours for many, many years, 25 years. And it was only a few years ago that we actually discovered, that Michael, more than just being our Armenian neighbor and friend, Michael actually had connections that were much deeper. And Michael was related to the Shore family, Samuel and Joseph Shore. Samuel Shore was a Jewish man from Sfat, if I'm not mistaken, who came to faith and became a Jewish follower of Jesus, and his parents as well. And Michael was also related. His grandmother was one Fanny Zimmerman. The Zimmerman family worked at Christchurch, were associated with the Hebrew-speaking congregation at this church. And Fanny Zimmerman met Hagop, again, someone who was living in the Armenian quarter. She married and raised a family. And Fanny is buried in the Armenian cemetery. It was Michael's grandmother. And when Michael told me about his family, he was very proud of his connection, yes, flesh and blood connection, with the Hebrew Christian or Jewish Christian community that was here at Christchurch. I met Michael in his home about 2 weeks ago. He was sick. He had leukemia, but nobody expected him to pass through his reward as fast as he did. He was a lovely, lovely man, a man who not only shared my taste in music, but more importantly, a man who really did love the Lord. And although he was a very committed member of the Armenian community here in Jerusalem, he was spiritually very open and very often attached himself to different evangelical groups here in the city. So I'd like his widow, Maro, to come up and say a few words about Michael. And where's Maro? Is she here? Maro, come. You have to get a little closer.
Okay. Distinguished guests, first of all, thank you so much for coming for Michael's funeral. It's been only a week that Michael departed from this world. And believe it or not, 30 years ago, Michael was the only one that he knew about Christchurch, because he said, Maro, let's go and have a coffee. He was the only one when we used to come here 30 years ago. And then all the Armenians got acquainted to the Christchurch. Since then, all the Armenians, they come to the Christchurch because of Michael, believe it or not. Michael was born 1943, and he was only 16 years old when he left Israel because he wanted to go get his education abroad in America. He got his BA, and he got his master's, and he got his PhD. Eventually, when we got married, really, I couldn't stand in America. I couldn't take it. I told Michael I would like to raise my kid in Israel. Eventually, we came here, and I have one daughter. Now, her name is Natalie. Now she is 35 years old, and she's married to her husband. Her name is Greg Myers. They are a very nice couple. And she went to Armenian school, and she learned 4 languages. She didn't know anything. She learned the Hebrew language, Armenian, Arabic, and English. And then she wanted to continue her education in America because she was born in America. But I told Natalie, please come, because it's the best thing to grow up in Israel, and you can go anywhere, and you can stand up on your feet. And sure, that's what happened, and now she's a doctor. And Michael taught for 25 years in the Armenian school mathematics. He was very well known. He traveled almost the world, but he loved the nature a lot and a lot, Michael. And he used to get very quick friendship with anybody. He used to talk, and I said, Michael, how come that you do something like this? And there's nothing wrong. I just want to talk with them. You know, he was very friendly. Thank God that he left very good name. He was like a father for the students in the Armenian seminary for 30 years, believe it or not. And he eventually, after getting sick and going to emergency in and out, so Pastor David came to our house. He wanted to honor Michael, and he said, we want you to be the guest of honor. But unfortunately, Michael passed away a week ago. And really, it's a big loss for the Armenian community because he knew a lot, and he explained a lot. When we wanted to know something, we always went to Michael to ask, what is this, what is that? He used to explain it to us. So I really appreciate for your coming, and thank you so much for attending the ceremony. Thank you so much.
By the way, just a PS on our relationship with the Armenian community. We, of course, established schools, hospitals, workshops in this country, and more or less they were open to Jews, and that segment of the Jewish community, which was quite large, that was poor and destitute. And I'm always proud that to acknowledge or to tell, speak to others by, or saying that Christ Church pretty much had the first systematic education for girls in the Middle East. And that was one of our contributions to Jerusalem. But after the massacre, the genocide, Turkish genocide against the Armenians that actually started in the 1890s and continued, reached a peak in 1915 and 1916, many Armenians moved to Jerusalem, and it was at that time that the London Jews Society, today CMJ, took pity on this Christian community and began to admit Armenian boys and girls to our schools, began to employ Armenians in our hospitals as doctors and nurses, and generally work towards the welfare of the Armenian community. In the 1930s, and even in 1940s, there were as many as 200 plus girls who would attend school here at Christ Church. And something like 30% were from the Armenian community. So we've had a special relationship with the Armenian community, in part, yes, driven by the massacre and the persecution that they suffered in Turkey. And Michael was just a living link in that relationship. Of course, he was more than just a historical link. His grandmother and his uncle were part of the community here at Christ Church. So we will miss Michael. He was indeed a very generous, warm, friendly presence, always wanting to be of help and of assistance. And I know in the life of my daughter Tamar, he was a very positive influence, spiritually and otherwise. So may the Lord bless his memory, and may his many good deeds continue to bear fruit for generations to come. And I hope that we can all say amen to that. Okay. Now we're here to celebrate not just the life of Michael Zakarian, but also the 175th birthday of the consecration of this church. And I've asked Richard Harvey to come from the UK to give us perhaps his perspective. Yeah, Richard being a historian, a theologian, will look at it from perhaps, hopefully, the view of an outsider and tell us what we've done well, and Richard, what we've not done so well. So please welcome Richard.
Thank you, David. It's such a privilege for me to be here today. And I feel that all I can really do is bring you greetings from London, England, where I live, to say thank you for being here. And I was in Israel on October the 7th, and this is my first time back since then. And I want to say thank you so much for all that you are doing to serve the Jewish people at this time, standing with them, many in deep places of suffering and grief. And we are here today as a testimony to the faithfulness of the God of Israel. And we are here today as a testimony to the fact that Yeshua of Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, is the risen Messiah, that one day will return to restore Israel and all nations. Now, I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes. Is that okay? But I will want to make sure there's time for some questions. And because I'm a Bible college teacher, I have a handout and a PowerPoint. And if we can start the PowerPoint, and I will start sharing my screen as well. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, please make sure we have your email. And there will be some further study resources afterwards. I find that most people learn best not through hearing a boring lecture, but through doing a little bit of homework afterwards. And I have some bedtime reading suggestions for you. So let me start my clock. Can you hear me okay at the back? And am I speaking at the right speed? And you're following me upstairs. Great. So Christ Church, Jerusalem, 1849 to 2024, a beacon of hope in the Middle East. My outline is a brief introduction. I'll explain a bit about my own interest, the historical context that we're looking at, a brief look at the sermon that was preached on the consecration day, and then the values that come from that sermon. So my evaluation is not just coming from my own perspective, but really from some of the values that I see in the original sermon preached on the consecration of Christ Church. Then we'll do a very quick survey through 175 years of history. History repeats itself. It has to. No one listens. History repeats itself. It has to. No one listens. History, I've said it already, haven't I? My bad English jokes. Please laugh politely. A brief survey of the history, and then some sort of evaluation and critique from my perspective as an insider, outsider. You can take the Jew out of CMJ, but it's difficult to take CMJ out of the Jew. And I've been associated with the ministry of CMJ for many years. A brief look at the hope for the future that we have as the community here at Christ Church, and some time for questions and discussion. I know that this is a meeting with many Jewish believers, there'll be lots of disagreements and lots of discussion. That's wonderful. So my own involvement really comes from an invitation from Alfred Sawyer. Does anybody remember him? From Georgia. And he said to me, as I was a young disciple of Yeshua based in London, he invited us to form the London Messianic Congregation in his church that he was pastoring in Finchley, very nice Jewish area. Margaret Thatcher was our member of parliament for many years. And then he said, come out to Israel and pray about coming to live in Jerusalem. And I remember praying on the top of the roof here, and somehow I really wanted to come, but the Lord seemed to say no. But I've always had a relationship of coming backwards and forwards to Israel. My first involvement was in 1974, just after the Yom Kippur War. Recently, I was invited to a fairly confidential meeting with Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, because he was due to sit down at a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu and UK Prime Minister Theresa May. And Justin Welby said, well, what do I say? And I was very pleased he used in his Twitter program, now called X, a line that I gave him. We are very pleased with what has been achieved, and there is much work still to be done, which can be taken in several different ways. I don't think anybody expected what was going to happen just last year. But as we overview the 175th anniversary of Christ Church, that's a lot of history for us to take in. Now, some of you live and breathe this history. You are guides, you are telling other people about it. Others are part of this community. And if we want to know where we're going, we need to know where we've come from, a good rabbinic phrase. So it's important for us to do that and to see Christ Church within the historic and contemporary contexts of Israel and the Middle East. Are you with me so far? The historical context. We could begin by going back as far as Abraham. Some 2,000 years before the coming of Yeshua. So 175 years is nothing. In fact, our people and our history were here even before the Anglican Church. Would you believe it? We've been here and we've been in Jerusalem since about 1000 BC, depending on how you date the acquisition of the city of David from the Jebusites. But we've been through all these periods of history and we're still here. Not because of anything in ourselves, but because of the providence of Hashem. And as we've lived through this history, we as a people have gone through many different changes. On one page, next slide please, it looks like this. Empires come and empires go, and we have survived. And if you look at Christ Church Jerusalem, we're right at the very end of the last period of great empires. So we are an absolute baby, even though we're good Anglicans, in terms of the big sweep of history. Next slide, please. In millennia, we're a baby. We're nearly 2 years old, 1 3/4 centuries. In centuries, we're 17 and a half. And if you remember what it was like as an adolescent, how did you feel at 17 and a half? You're just beginning to function, and you're just beginning to understand what you're looking for. So I would say that although 175 years seems a long time, we're actually just beginning. And until the Messiah returns, which I hope will be very soon, we need to keep growing and pressing on to maturity. Now, for the homework, you can skip the next 2 slides. I give you more detail on what it's like to be a 2-year-old and what it's like to be an adolescent. But let's skip forward 3 slides to the imperial context of the 19th century, where Christ Church is beginning to be an idea in the minds of the British. The British policies and the imperial ambitions after the Napoleonic Wars and with the changing facets of the Ottoman Empire led to a speculation about the future of the Middle East as the toy that the great powers of Europe would begin to bargain for, play with, and negotiate over. And although now, in the era of nationalism and in the nation state, we recognize that Israel is an independent nation, this was never really the plan of the great powers. There was a colonizing and an imperializing tendency. Landscapes were being reshaped, especially in Egypt. Arab nationalism slowly beginning, and of course Jewish nationalism with the Zionist movement. Next slide, please. We're going to jump through that. That's your homework. Next slide, please. Lady Palmerston and the evangelical renewal in England had a letter that she wrote to her husband, Lord Palmerston. I feel like you very strongly that there is something miraculous in the course of late events. It cannot be accident that all these things should have so turned out. My impression is that it is the restoration of the Jews and fulfillment of the prophecies. But we shall see what comes next. And I have long been thinking of this, even before your letter and all the circumstances you mentioned, some of which had escaped me. It is certainly very curious that Acre seems to have fallen down like the walls of Jericho, and Ibrahim's army dispersed like the countless hosts that were the enemies of the Jews, as we see in the Old Testament. Now, we move from Christian Hebraism to Philo-Semitism to restorationism to what then would be called Christian Zionism. But it's an amorphous movement of expectation with no fixed theology that begins to restore hopes in the restoration of the Jewish people. And religious and political currents come together. I'm conscious that Kelvin and David and others would explain this far better than me. But this leads to the political program for the Jerusalem bishopric. Let's move on, please. So you have Anglo-Prussian collaboration, strategic and religious significance of Jerusalem to lead to the first bishop being appointed, Protestant bishop, with missionary and diplomatic objectives. And this, of course, leads to controversies and challenges. And I won't argue the colonial discourse here, but we should see Christchurch as coming fortuitously to arise in this context. Next slide, please, is a homework slide. And the next slide, please. The documents, compiled massively by the man who wanted the job. Next slide, please. Hechler. You know the story of Hechler? A great Christian Zionist, according to Theodor Herzl. So they're one of the first uses of the term. English restorationist, Anglican clergyman, eschatological writer, crusader against anti-Semitism, promoter of Zionism, and aide, counselor, friend, and legitimizer of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. And Hechler also thought that he would be right to be considered for the job, which is perhaps a word of advice to those of us who are looking for promotion. Wait for somebody else to put you forward. And so the next slide, please. There he is with the documents. In fact, the job goes to Michael Solomon Alexander, and I'm just so grateful to be here in the church with the altarpiece and with the signs of his presence here. Hebrew professor in London, Bible translator, prayer book translator, had services in Hebrew, in Arabic, formed the House of Industry for Jewish disciples of Yeshua, and final resting place on Mount Zion. Are you following me okay? I've lost my PowerPoint, but that's not unusual, so let me see what happened there. Yeah, next slide, please. And the next slide. Bishop Gobat comes to the job because, sadly, Solomon Alexander dies within just a few years of his appointment. And Bishop Gobat had been a missionary already. He was not primarily focused on the Jewish people. And in fact, much of his own focus would be on the other Christian groups in the region and the Muslims as well as the Jews. There he is, and there's even a boarding house named after him. And he came and preached a sermon. The next slide, please, as his enthronement sermon. The next slide, please. On Isaiah 56, 6 to 8. Back one, I think. Yes, that one. And foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants. And everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and holds fast my covenant. He doesn't mention these verses, by the way. He just picks on the phrase. And I would rather he did an exegesis of the whole passage. But it goes on, these I will bring to my holy temple and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. The Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel, declares, I will gather yet others to him beside those already gathered. My Hebrew is terrible, but I tried. Ki beiti, beit tefillah, yikareh lakol ha'amim. A house of prayer for all the amim. Now, actually, in the sermon Gobat preaches, he doesn't say peoples in the plural, he says peoples in the singular, and then universalizes it in a way. But let's look a little at his sermon. I'm sure that David reads this sermon every night before he goes to bed. 6,500 words of a sermon. I reckon it took him about an hour and 10 minutes to preach. And if you'd like your bedtime reading, you can read the consecration sermon preached by Bishop Gobat at the consecration of the church. But he has some very good, what we would call today, core values. And he talks about how the consecration of Christ Church is a result of prayer. And then he says that prayer is the foundation of all that we seek to do for God. And if this house is to be a house of prayer for all nations, it needs to be welcoming and it needs to be witnessing. And if this is a house of prayer, there will be great personal and communal benefits for those of us who are part of it. And if it is a house of prayer, it will lead to the restoration of Israel. I love reading old sermons, don't you? Sometimes it's a cure for insomnia. But I would recommend this sermon, and I've given you a link for it in your homework, to really meditate on this, because he was a man of prayer. And prayer is something that comes through in this sermon over and over again. More than 100 times he mentions prayer or praise or supplication. And more than 20 times he talks about Christ Church being a house of prayer for all nations. Next slide, please. A house of prayer that reflects the essence of Isaiah 56, verse 7. And here's a word for CMJ committee. He says the committee never meet for consultation without first asking the Lord for guidance. And may that long continue, even if you don't like sitting on committees. He then says, notwithstanding innumerable difficulties, and time does not allow us to go through all the political shenanigans, the agreements with the Ottoman Empire, James Finn as consul having to draft all the documents, backwards and forwards in the British Parliament. There was a lot of obstacles, not least money, but the money came. And he says that prayer is there as the foundation of our work and to bring us the necessary means to do our work and to overcome the obstacles and the resistance that we are bound to meet in our work. Have you ever found that true in your life? Prayer. The first church, after more than 1,000 years, dedicated, he says, to the pure and scriptural service of Almighty God. Now, I don't think his remarks would have been too popular in ecumenical services and circles today, because he talks about the benighted fellow creatures who worship saints and angels. I don't know who he means. Maybe he's talking... who have pictures and bones, relics, wood and atone. And he's not very kind to some of the other religious traditions. And I think as CMJ, we would ask forgiveness. And we would want to repent of our lack of charity and our judgmental spirit on some of our other Christian traditions. If you're here from another Christian, Messianic, Jewish, Catholic, whatever, please forgive us. But he has a point to make. And then he goes on, it's consecrated through prayer. And the next slide, please. Prayer is foundational, not only as the physical construction of Christ Church, but as a foundational element in all its activities and services, aiming to bring people closer to God. If this church, he says, is to be, as it is intended, a standing witness in the midst of our erring brethren, please forgive us, and in the presence of Jews and Muslims around us, and again, we aren't trying to be triumphalistic, we are simply trying to show in our own humility and brokenness that we have found the Messiah Yeshua around us. It is our bounden duty to make it to be, in the highest spiritual sense of the word, a house of prayer, where we recognize our own inadequacy, our own need for God's love and forgiveness in our lives, our own sense of his mercy and provision and power and protection. And this is what he's trying to say. Next slide, please. And then we become a place of what we would say now inclusivity and witness. And as this building can be a house of God, a place where he delights to meet and bless his people, only insofar as maintain it as the character of a house of prayer. And he talks about the blessings and the advantages, and he includes the spirit of grace and supplication, the prophetic words of Zechariah. These are the core values. Are you getting them before we look at the whole history? The spiritual and communal benefits. Next slide, please. He talks about spiritual growth, communal harmony, and the transformative power of prayer in individuals and the community, leading to a deeper relationship with God and one another. And in my life, I've been so blessed by coming and sharing in fellowship here at Christ Church, in Bet Emmanuel, with the CMJ family, because I've been refreshed in my spirit. And I've been blessed and encouraged by the fellowship of people who love the Lord and love my people and want us to grow in our wisdom and maturity. All the services of the church, he says, in this house of prayer, some 20 times. And the final part, which is there if you look for it, but I think it comes at the end of the sermon, the hope for the restoration of the Jewish people, with the belief that God's grace will be bestowed in response to sincere prayer. On account of the shortness of the time, I must be as brief as possible, he says. And like a typical preacher, he says finally, and then goes on another 2,000 or 3,000 words. But he does say this, but above all, there is one special advantage to be expected: the restoration of Israel, and house of prayer for Jews and Gentiles, for all people, a church of Messiah, Christ, the Saviour of the world. And for your homework, you can read the rest of the sermon. If it's worth preaching once, it's worth preaching many times. If it's not worth preaching once, don't preach it. The restoration of Israel. So these give me my categories for looking at the history of Christchurch in about 20 minutes. Goback did not really follow strictly the policies of CMJ. He decided to broaden the missionary scope and directed his energies towards the evangelization of Christians from other churches, and to some extent the Muslim and the Jewish community. And of course, he wasn't the vicar here, he was the bishop. And there is a doctrinal thesis by Charlotte van der Leest on conflict and conversion in Palestine, which looks particularly at his ministry. But I'm going to go through the incumbents. Next slide. And we have only about 22. I think there's probably more, because there's a few gaps and a few interregnums. And I can only select a few to think about the times that they were living in, the challenges that they faced, and how they matched up to Goback's 5 priorities. And this is on the list on the website Christchurch has. All the resources are there. I'm very privileged that I knew Roger Allison, Ronald Nadeney, David Price, Alfred Sawyer. I still know my good friends Ray and Tony, Murray and David. So I've lived through some of this, and some of you have as well. But it's interesting to try and trace what's happening, and we'll do that briefly now. Next slide, please. John Nicolaisen, his grave on the Mount of Olives. It says it all. 23 years a faithful watchman on the walls of Jerusalem, fearless in the midst of war. Let's say that again. Fearless in the midst of war. Well, I know we're all feeling fear at times right now. But he was able to share a message of comfort and consolation and encouragement in the midst of war. Fearless in the midst of war, pestilence and earthquake, a master in all the learning of the Hebrews and the Arabs, founder of the English hospital and builder of the Protestant church, lived, beloved and died lamented by Christians, Jews and Mohammedans. What a wonderful testimony to his life and ministry. And whilst Christchurch is always much more than the minister sets a tone and a character for the community. Conrad Schick, I mentioned him, he wasn't a vicar here, but he was here 1822 to 1901 because of the great influence he had as an architect, an archaeologist, as a missionary. He really did contribute to the infrastructure of the modern state as much as to the building up of Christchurch here. And many of you know the library and will study his influence. But we're going on to Joseph Barclay, bishop from 1879 to 1891, but he was actually the incumbent here. And then he left and went back to UK because of personality difficulties and political clashes. And then he came back. I think what helped him was he was vicar of Stapleford in the St Alban diocese, which is just next to where I live. So he must have been refreshed and then did his scholarship, got his DD, and was appointed bishop as well. He was most enthusiastically welcomed to Jerusalem and entered on his duties with his usual vicar. But his sudden death after a short illness in October 1881 put an end to the hopes of those who believed that at last some of the objectives of the original founders of the Anglo-Prussian bishopric in Jerusalem were to be realized. Isn't this the story of our lives? We are not at liberty to finish the work, nor are we free to desist it, say the rabbis. We are maybe not going to see the fruit of our own lives and ministries. Others will come in and continue that. And yet we leave our lives as a testimony to our own faith and pilgrimage, and we seek to help disciples follow on. Barclay's homework section is next, so we'll jump through to the next one, please. James Neal. I don't know much about James Neal. I couldn't find a picture of him. I'm sure David has some in the library there. But he wrote and he encouraged the regathering of Israel, and he wrote textbooks for Bible college students, if they read textbooks these days. I don't know if they do. Everyday life in the Holy Land and Palestine explored. The next one, please. Arthur Hastings Kelk. Again, I didn't find it easy to find a photo of him. I'm sure you have some archive photos. I did find that his son died in the First World War. And again, as I think of the suffering that our people are going through now, and the Palestinian people also, I recognize how much loss and bereavement and mourning is often part of our ministry of prayer and intercession. Kelk was incumbent here for 22 years, from 1879 to 1901, one of the longest serving. His tenure was characterized by significant contributions to education and service. Upon his departure from Jerusalem, Kelk received a heartfelt presentation from the Hebrew Christian community. Now, the Hebrew Christian Alliance of Palestine only really formed at the beginning of the 1900s. But of course, Christchurch was the place of welcome and hospitality for communities and individuals who were Jewish believers right up until the days of the modern Messianic movement today. Kelk passed away on January 27, 1908, serving the Society CMJ for 30 years, and also contributed to Anglican hymnology. It's always good to have a hobby, isn't it? And wrote, "And flowers plucked in those holy fields." I have a copy of that book with pressed flowers from the land of what was Palestine in the book. These people set a tone, don't they? A very English tone at the moment, a rather colonial tone, may I even use the word imperial tone. And yet there is a sweet, beneficent attitude, a sensibility here of love for God, love for Yeshua, love for the people of Israel, love for the inhabitants of the land, faithful service in the midst of opposition, and most of all, a person of prayer. The next one, please. A couple of Jewish believers that came through Christchurch. They were just one of many hundreds, but Christchurch had a significant influence. You know Naftali Z. Imber, the author of Hatikvah, the English national anthem. English? Israeli. Sorry, I've got my... When I'm in Israel, I feel English, and when I'm in England, I feel Jewish, so it's very confusing. Israel Zwangli, the great author, said that such a poet should have written Hatikvah, the Marseillaise, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, of every Zionist meeting throughout the world, is one of the innumerable ironies of Jewish life, because Imber's life was a mess. He drank. He went to everyone. He didn't have a disciplined life, but he wrote some amazing songs and poems. Menachem Begin said of Hatikvah, "It became the song of the Jewish heart, of our historic longing for our love for the land of Zion and Jerusalem." And in 1882, Imber moved to Ottoman Palestine as a secretary of Sir Lawrence Oliphant, a Christian Zionist visionary. And then he moved to Jerusalem, where he became ill and stayed in the London Society Hospital. He didn't like the Rothschild Hospital. He said there were too many fleas. So he came to the CMJ Hospital. And there he met regularly with Jewish believer, CMJ worker Herman Friedlander, and with his excessive drinking, eccentric behavior, and questionable contact with Christian missionaries, he would always talk about his Christian friends to his Jewish friends, and he would write this: "My heart is conquered by the gospel, but my head does not agree with it. And so many of us as Jewish disciples of Yeshua have this conflict within us on becoming a disciple of Yeshua. And of course, it's no sin to be Jewish. You don't stop being Jewish when you become a follower of Yeshua. In fact, you know what it means. But the sense of conflict that Imber felt led to some of his great poetic outpourings, I think, was also able to motivate him to write Hatikva. And another Jewish believer, I'm going to jump through Carnegie Brown, and the next one, please. And I'm going to jump through John Rooker, but you see the times that they're living through. Back one, please. Just John Rooker, 1920, and he's actually there, I think, when Allenby comes through in 1917. We've got all these wars around us, and Christ Church is continuing to survive and to thrive and to minister to those who are going through casualty and loss and change of their lives. And we'll go to the next one, please. John Rooker. Malcolm Maxwell again. The Palestine riots in 1929, the burdening and increasing conflict. He's there ministering. And the next one, please. Bill Martin, I didn't meet, but he was able to welcome Holocaust survivors to the land of Israel and to the church. The Jewish Brigade's formation, the Holocaust. This is times of ministry in Christ Church and in the land. Next one, please. Hugh Jones. Did anybody here know Hugh Jones? Many of us knew Ursula Jones, his wonderful wife, founding member of our London Messianic group. And the controversy here is on Operation Exodus, or Operation Mercy as it was called. The evacuation of about 100 Hebrew Christians, Jewish disciples of Jesus, around the time of the War of Independence. And in May to July 1948, Hugh Jones, who was here, was able to oversee this evacuation. But of course, today it seems almost like an act of betrayal. And my friends Gershon Norell and Kai Kier Hansen have written detailed studies of this in the book, in the magazine Mishkan. And Jones presided over this, doing what he thought was best and right at the time. Her Majesty's government had written a letter saying, please encourage all citizens or all British subjects, whatever section you may decide upon as the result of this warning must be taken on your own responsibility. But in reaching a decision, you should remember that the longer you delay, the more difficult your subsequent departure may become. And that was a letter sent to all those who had any right of leaving the country at the time. I don't know what we would have done in that situation, but I know today Christ Church is so fully involved in standing with our people in the current war. And I was here on October the 7th. I landed at Ben Gurion Airport, and as we were driving to the terminal, get out, lie on the ground, and the bombs were going off overhead. And when I got to Yad HaShmonah, I found that my rear behind was on the CNN News because a CNN cameraman was on the same flight and had taken pictures of us lying on the tarmac at Ben Gurion Airport. And of course, we are living now through the most terrible times. And my heart goes out to all of you here and say, we are praying for you back in England as well. And I know that CMJ, the Anglican Ministry, Christ Church, is doing all it possibly can right now to stand with our people and also to pray for the end of this war. So Hugh Jones, moving on. Roger Allison, again, a wonderful man of God, a great humble servant of God who wrote his memoirs. He sees the 67 war and its aftermath. We have the beginnings of Jewish believers in Jesus meeting at Emmanuel House, Bet Emmanuel. Henry Knight is there. The UCCI is there as well. Can you go back one slide? Is Lily Simon. I am so interested in the plight of Jewish believers in Jesus and how Christ Church has ministered to them over the years. Lily Simon was a Jewish disciple of Jesus, but she was only Jewish from her father's side. And her sense of growing up in Germany during the Arian laws made her curious, and she started studying theology. And she even studied theology with one of the greatest theologians, Karl Barth. She went on to get her doctorate, but she was not allowed to take her certificate because of the Arian laws. And so she started moving around. She went to England, France, Amsterdam, Germany again, Switzerland, and then came to teach at the CMJ Anglican School in Romania, Bucharest. And there she is with the teachers. Thank you, David, for sending me some of these archive pictures. You can see then she went on to Jerusalem, and there's a letter postmarked Jerusalem, Paris, Leipzig, Germany. It's been censored, it's been stamped with the Nazi swastika of the Gestapo, and it finally gets to the incumbent Martin at Christ Church and is passed on to Lily. And she is a great teacher. She teaches at Rehovot Grammar School, Israeli secular school, and she is eventually back in Germany. But Christ Church was a home of escape for her. Roger Allison, I've been through, so next slide. And we'll come towards the end. Ronald Aidney, the Aidney family, a wonderful dynasty of Anglican leaders who have served so faithfully within CMJ. Next one, please. David Price, my first encounter with David back in 1982. And many of you will remember him seeing the work here during the Israeli invasion, the Lebanon campaign, seeing the development of Bet Emmanuel with Henry Knight, Jeanette Ross, Salim Munaya, Walter Riggins, and others. Next one, please. Alfred Sawyer, I have to say Alfred with my Georgia accent. Again, a passionate, faithful servant of God. And the encouragement he gave to us. We didn't always agree with him. I never agreed with his accent. He tried to sell me his car once. I didn't want his car either. But the passion and the vision and the willingness to serve are significant. And of course, Benjamin and Reuben here, I think it was under Alfred that you began your ministry. I'm so grateful. It's lovely to see that. Next one, please. Michael Cohen, or Neil Cohen, as he was known to many of us, Tony Higdon, Murray Dixon, tumultuous times, not particularly long, sojourns, but significant, all of them. And then Ray Lockhart, going through the Gulf War and the Oslo Accords. 4 minutes left. Can you hold on just to the end? Yeah. I'm thinking about their prayer life. I'm thinking about making this house a life of prayer. I'm thinking about their gentleness and graciousness and the way that they open their arms in fellowship. And the next one, please. Oh, I can't mention David. He's here already. But David, you're a representative example. Thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your love for my people, for these communities here, for your visionary leadership. Thank you. And thank you everyone here tonight for standing with my people and standing with Israel in these times and standing with the Messiah Yeshua. Now, David knows far more about these things than I, but he's invited me as an outsider to come and share a few thoughts, but he will answer all the difficult questions. But to think about the changes in the community here and its ministry, and the Mercy Fund in particular. Back one. Yeah. Back one, please. the Mercy Fund, the war that we're going through, the other situations. Thank you, David, the 7 myths, the other things that we are trying to do to share what this place is about. And the next one, please. David briefly mentioned to me the challenges of the Mercy Fund looking ahead. And this will be your homework as well, but they need people, they need resources, they need wisdom, they need finances to serve the needs which are often behind the scenes and not publicized of so many different communities here in Jerusalem and in the area. Thank you for what you're doing. And the next one, please. So how do I evaluate 175 years? Well, my Dutch friends have taught me not to be negative. But if you don't see something that you'd like to see, you say, I would like to see more of. Well, I'd like to see more prayer in my own life and in the lives of all our communities. 175 years, 22 incumbents, hundreds of Jewish disciples of Yeshua, thousands of visitors, maybe hundreds of thousands of visitors, ongoing ministry, fellowship and initiatives, ministry to Jewish people, to Arabs, to everyone else. Much goes on behind the scenes. And you are a vital part of Israel's life, communities, culture, and history. When you're Jewish and you believe in Yeshua, you get the best of both worlds. You get Saturdays off and Sundays. You get Christmas presents on Christmas Day and 8 days of Hanukkah presents at Hanukkah. But you have double the headaches because you're caught in between different groups who don't really know each other, understand each other, and often don't even like each other. I think that's part of Christ Church's privilege and responsibility. To be a house of prayer for all nations means to be a place of reconciliation. To be a house of prayer for all nations means to be a place where forgiveness and humility rank higher than power and position. To be a house of prayer for all nations means that the next 175 years, if Yeshua hasn't returned, are going to be even better. Let me leave you with a word of hope from Paul's letter to the Romans. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. And a final word, I think, also comes from Kelvin Crombie. I had to put him in somewhere. He's a great friend. But in the postscript of his book on Solomon Alexander, he says this: as we enter the 21st century in Jerusalem, Christ Church continues to be a community of Jews and Gentiles believing Alexander's and Nicolaus's teaching and pursuing their vision. In the church, the Heritage Center, Alexander College, Shoresh Study Tours, Emmanuel Bookshop, the Guest House, and the independent Hebrew-speaking congregations, plural, I think. The vision of a restored Israel and of the one new man in Messiah Yeshua. And like Alexander and Nicolaus, they await the coming of Yeshua, who it is believed will consummate God's covenant relationship with Israel and the redeemed of the nations. Even so, come, Lord Yeshua. Maranatha. Amen.
Questions for Richard? Questions? maybe not so many comments or personal theological observations, but questions about the presentation, and especially about the very encouraging way in which you ended your talk. You earned your supper. Any Okay. Disagreements? Concerns? Objections? Complaints? Oh, where's Daryl? Is he still here? Daryl? No, Daryl's gone. I think if you count the people who work for us at the school, over 200. We're a minor industry. Yes, so 200. At our peak, we had, before this war, probably 45 people working on this compound. Yeah. So some in ministry, some in service, all ministry, of course. Yeah. Pardon? You can't hear? Yes. Okay. So 200 work for us in this country. Yeah. Other questions? You know, there's, yeah. Tiffany. What? The prayer garden was, it's always been a prayer garden, and many people over the years have told me how really they've had an encounter with the Lord in that garden. And to tell you the truth, Tiffany, we put the sign there to keep certain groups of people from turning it into their picnic space or an area which they can barbecue and do other things, usually without asking permission. So the answer is sort of mixed in that regard. So, you know, this being Jerusalem, people are not very, they're not used to asking permission, just forgiveness. Okay? Other questions that maybe even Richard can answer, especially from maybe the understanding of Messianic Judaism, and also reconciliation. And I'd just like to stress that, at least how we see reconciliation. The reconciliation isn't an end in itself. I know it's cool and hip in secular society as well as in many Christian circles to talk about the value of reconciliation, but I think sometimes we forget what reconciliation is supposed to lead to. Reconciliation, if we go on from the one new man in Ephesians 2, and we go to the end of the chapter, reconciliation is for the purpose, yes, of building a community in which God can dwell, right? That the community becomes a holy temple, right? That's right where God himself, the Spirit, dwells, right? The community is the temple. And of course, God does not dwell, or at least his presence is squelched when there is division or backbiting or ethnic conflict, jealousies, and so on. Yes, so our goal is reconciliation, but it's reconciliation with the aim, right, of facilitating the presence of the Lord. Yes, and a more intimate and deeper relationship with God. Okay. Yeah. I don't, you know, you have to, Gila's question is CMJ in some way looking at things from a different perspective, you know, due to the war. And I think, of course, we always reject unfair criticism of Israel, but at the same time, I don't think any of us, think that Israel should be given a blank check or is beyond criticism. But I would say going deeper than that, there has been a history of CMJ in this country for quite a long time, in which there have been wars and revolutions and peasant rebellion and famine, and of course the First World War, the Holocaust, the rise of the State of Israel, and CMJ workers and Jewish believers and Arab believers, right, that have been associated with our community, they have lived through some horrible, horrible events and horrible times. And this is one more of those events. And I know we're all shocked by the horror of what's going on, and hopefully we're all empathetic to the sufferings of people in Gaza. But this is not the first time, that we've lived through. You may recall, some of you may recall, that at one time we had a number of thriving Hebrew Christian communities throughout Europe. 95% of those believers, whether they were in Lvov or Amsterdam, Warsaw, Krakow, other places, they were all murdered by the Nazis. They were all murdered for being Jews. Not for being Christians, but for being Jews, right? So this is part of the legacy it's part of the legacy that we carry with us. And when Richard mentioned, suffering and bereavement, virtually every person that he mentioned, the Finns, the Alexanders, the Barclays, Nicolaisen, and more, we have a cemetery several hundred meters away from here. It's full of the graves of their children. People who came to serve Jews and Arabs in this country in the context of Christ Church and CMJ, they paid a very high personal price. A very high personal price. Yes, there was a lot of suffering and loss, and they came at a time when you didn't fly back to England, every 6 months to see your family. Right? It was a bit apocalyptic, but there's certain truth to it, that when missionaries, 19th century missionaries, went to a foreign country, from Britain, Germany, Holland, they brought their caskets with them because many of them knew they were not going home. So whatever we think of their motives, they weren't exactly pure. We cannot fault them for their willingness, to to give fully of themselves, to nowadays what? Well, can the CMJ send more people to help us? Depends on the Ministry of the Interior. It doesn't depend on us. But we have many local people, Israeli citizens, who are working here. And the Mercy Fund has 7 people working towards helping Israelis, helping Palestinians. If I let them, they would hire another 50 or 60 people. But we don't have the budget for that. So the work of the Mercy Fund, for example, has expanded considerably. And so too is the work of CMJ in providing war relief in many different ways. We don't have time to go into that. But there's been a great outpouring from Christians around the world wanting to help the people in this country. And many of them have given to CMJ towards that end. In fact, Gilo, we're overwhelmed with requests from different Arab and Jewish organizations, to help them. And we've been blessed with a lot of resources, but at the same time, it's you might say the The number of requests or cries for help has been overwhelming. But there are many other Christian organizations who've done quite a lot in this regard. Yes, Firm, King of Kings, and more. So I think the Christian community or Christian communities from around the world have been genuinely empathetic and have tried to alleviate some of the suffering in this country, while at the same time saying to, especially to Israel and the Jewish world, you know, not everybody hates you, or not everybody, you know, thinks, you know, you're war criminals or committing genocide. So, okay, other questions? And questions for Richard? Yes? Yeah, I'll come up.
Yeah. So the question is, it's a question about the complicated relationship between political and theological factors. How would I define now the theological profile of Christ Church? I started off studying politics, and I changed to studying theology, because I realized that politics is an outworking of your view of humanity, your view of man and woman, your view of society. But at the end of the day, for me, theology is the queen of sciences. So I have a healthy doctrine of providence, that Hashem uses the devices and desires of the nations to achieve God's own goals. So if the ongoing election of the Jewish people is a theological given, that God's covenant with Israel to be a means of blessing to all nations is a very deep manifestation of the love of God and the person of God. And I'm Trinitarian, Father, Son, and Ruach HaKodesh. Yes. Oh, God bless you. Thank you. Yeah, so my theology is grounding my understanding of politics. But politics, of course, is the art of the possible, the competing for resources and power. So I do see a very interesting flowing together of British and other imperial aims in exploiting the weakened Ottoman Empire and developing the Middle East as what would become the fulcrum for global politics. And the resurgence of restorationist hopes for the Jewish people, coming from the Puritans, coming from the German Pietists, coming from the Evangelical Revival, coming from the early missionary movement, which was very connected, the Church Mission Society and the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. What a terrible mouthful. But they had the Earl of Shaftesbury, and they had Lord Palmerston, and they had the Duke of Wales as their patrons. And I don't think they could separate in their own minds, because I read the CMJ committee meeting papers going back to this, what their real motives were. Some of it was for the restoration of the Jewish people to the land. Some of it was for what I will call a colonial expansion of the church. And I know I will get criticized by my friend David for using that term. Some of it was an evangelistic mandate. Some of it was highly eschatological, although, and by the way, the book that several books for homework. Restoring Israel, Kelvin Crombie. You owe me a spoon for that, Kelvin. British Mission to the Jews in the 19th Century, Yaron Perry, and his mentor Alex Carmel, I knew back in the 80s. A Short History of Christian Zionism by Donald Lewis really looks at the rather nebulous way that Christian Zionism formed. It was linked to certain eschatological systems, but it didn't find a particular home in them. And even today, the Christian Zionist movement, of which many are part here, and some are here because of that, is a movement. It's moving. And who knows what it will look like when we come to post-conflict restoration. And of course, these are ideological battles that are being fought, especially amongst my evangelical friends in America. So I cannot give you a question, except as a PhD student, I know that I have to find a method to answer a question, and the ontology dictates the epistemology. The thing that you're examining should help you find how to examine it. And you try and find the best explanation you can. But all politics is God's politics at the end because of providential working out of God's purposes.
Other questions? Do we have an eschatology here at the moment, Richard? A defined eschatology?
You, my dear brother, have a very, in one sense, a good Anglican way of holding several things in tension. But also, it would be, I mean, most Messianic Jews, I find, don't write down their theologies. And there won't be formal church documents that say anything more than the creed. Do you still have the 39 articles? So I don't think that you have an articulated eschatology in theory, but in practice you are living it out. And you are living it out in a way that is life-giving because you're willing to sacrifice. And at the end of the day, you know, if you don't understand eschatology, don't worry. It's not the end of the world. But actually it is, it's important. But we should all be living with eschatology in our hearts. But we don't all write it down as a system. Yeah.
Maybe we'll answer your question. It's okay if
Okay.
So thank you very much for coming. Any compliments or any gratitude for tonight's talk, please see Richard or buy one of his books at the back. The books are really good and they're really cheap. I forgot the limerick, but the devil runs when he sees books as good and cheap as these or something. Anyway, certainly, you know, the malicious powers don't want you to buy one of Richard's books, but please consider. And finally, yeah, if you have any complaints, just put them on TripAdvisor, okay? Good night, everybody.
Thank you.